A young Protestant in rural Georgia was clearing land for his family's new farmhouse when his shovel struck something hard underground. What he unearthed was a centuries-old statue of the Virgin Mary, and touching it changed his life forever. The Georgia sun was merciless that August morning in 2019 as 22-year-old David Campbell drove his pickup truck down the dusty dirt road toward the 40 acres his family had just purchased outside Thomasville. The land had been in foreclosure for over a decade, left abandoned after the previous owners defaulted on their mortgage during the 2008 financial crisis. David came from 5 generations of Presbyterian farmers. The Campbell family had worked Georgia soil since the 1870s, building a reputation for hard work, solid faith, and an unwavering commitment to Protestant principles. His great-great-grandfather had been one of the founding members of Thomasville Presbyterian Church, and the family had never missed a Sunday service in living memory. "This land's got good bones," his father, James Campbell, had said when they first walked the property 6 months earlier. "Just need some Campbell sweat equity to bring it back to life." The plan was ambitious but achievable. Clear the overgrown sections, build a modest farmhouse, and expand the family's cotton and peanut operation. David, fresh out of agricultural college at the University of Georgia, was eager to prove himself worthy of carrying on the Campbell farming legacy. But as he parked his truck near the designated house site that morning, David had no idea he was about to uncover something that would challenge everything he'd been taught about faith, history, and divine intervention. The previous owners had been the Hernandez family, Mexican immigrants who'd worked the land for about 15 years before the economic downturn forced them into bankruptcy. Local gossip painted them as hard-working but different, Catholic, Spanish-speaking, and keeping mostly to themselves in a community that was predominantly white and Protestant. They were good people, David's mother, Ruth Campbell, had acknowledged when neighbors expressed surprise at the family's decision to buy the Mexican place. "Just not our kind of people, if you know what I mean." David knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't necessarily racism. The Campbells considered themselves above such prejudices, but it was definitely cultural and religious separation. In their worldview, Catholics were misguided at best, practicing a form of Christianity so corrupted by superstition and idol worship that it barely qualified as the same religion. "They pray to Mary instead of Jesus," his grandfather had explained when David was young. "They bow down to statues and think dead saints can hear their prayers. It's not biblical, son. Not biblical at all." This morning, David was focused on practical matters, not theological ones. He had borrowed a small excavator from his cousin Mike to begin clearing the foundation area for the new house. The work was hot, dusty, and backbreaking, but David found satisfaction in the physical labor and the knowledge that he was building something permanent for future Campbell generations. By 10 a.m., he'd already cleared about half an acre when the excavator's bucket struck something that definitely wasn't Georgia clay or tree roots. The metallic clang echoed across the field, and David felt the machine shudder with the impact. "What the hell?" he muttered, shutting off the engine and climbing down to investigate. At first, he thought he'd hit an old septic tank or water pipe, something left over from the Hernandez family's time on the land. But as he brushed away the red clay soil, what emerged was clearly much older than anything from the past 15 years. It was stone-carved stone, weathered and stained but unmistakably crafted by human hands. David knelt down and began digging with his hands, his curiosity overriding his usual caution. What he unearthed over the next hour would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a statue about 3 feet tall, carved from what appeared to be limestone or marble. Despite being buried for God knows how long, the craftsmanship was remarkable. Delicate facial features, flowing robes, hands positioned in prayer. But what stopped David's heart was the recognition of who this statue depicted. Even raised in a Protestant household that viewed Catholic imagery with suspicion, David knew he was looking at a representation of the Virgin Mary. More specifically, as he would later learn, it was Our Lady of Guadalupe, complete with the characteristic tilted head, the star-covered mantle, and the hands pressed together in prayer. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then immediately felt guilty for taking the Lord's name in vain while staring at his mother. The statue was beautiful in a way that made David's chest tight. There was something about the carved face that seemed almost alive, peaceful but sorrowful, maternal but powerful. He found himself staring into the stone eyes and feeling as though they were staring back. David had never been particularly religious, despite his family's church attendance. He believed in God, certainly, and he considered himself a Christian, but faith had always been more of a cultural inheritance than a personal conviction. He said the prayers, sang the hymns, and listened to the sermons without them penetrating very deeply into his heart. But kneeling in the Georgia dirt, looking at this unexpected discovery, David felt something he'd never experienced before, a presence that seemed to emanate from the carved stone. "This is crazy," he said aloud, as if speaking could break whatever spell the statue seemed to be casting. "It's just a rock. Just a piece of carved stone." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. David's first instinct was to call his father, but something stopped him. James Campbell would want the statue destroyed immediately, that much was certain. "Graven images," he would say. "Idolatry. Get that Catholic nonsense off our land." Instead, David found himself reaching out to touch the statue's face. The moment his fingertips made contact with the weathered stone, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic. No lightning, no voices from heaven, no miraculous visions. But David felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening in a room he didn't know existed. The sensation was warm, comforting, and oddly familiar, as though he was remembering something he'd forgotten rather than experiencing something new. "Mary," he whispered, though he had no idea why. The name felt natural on his lips, like a prayer he'd always known but never spoken. David sat back on his heels, his hand still resting on the statue's carved cheek, and tried to make sense of what he was feeling. Peace, certainly, but also a profound sense of protection, as though he'd stumbled upon something that had been watching over this land long before his family claimed it. He thought about the Hernandez family, who had lost everything and been forced to abandon their home. Had this statue been their secret? Had they buried it to protect it before the foreclosure? The thought filled him with an unexpected sadness. For the next hour, David sat in the Georgia heat, holding the statue and feeling something fundamental shift in his understanding of faith, of God, of the mysterious ways divine love manifests in the world. When he finally stood up, his legs stiff from kneeling, David knew his life had changed irrevocably. He couldn't explain how or why, but he was no longer the same young man who had started excavating that morning. The practical question now was what to do with his discovery. David's first impulse was to clean the statue properly and study it more carefully. Using a soft brush and some water from his truck, he gently removed centuries of accumulated dirt and clay. As the carved details emerged more clearly, the statue's beauty became even more pronounced. The face was serene but alive with expression. The robes were intricately detailed with patterns that seemed to tell a story. And the hands, the praying hands, seemed to pulse with an energy that David couldn't explain but couldn't deny. By noon, with the Georgia sun beating down mercilessly, David made a decision that would have shocked his family if they'd known about it. Instead of continuing his excavation work, he carefully lifted the statue and carried it to his truck. He drove not toward home, but toward town, his mind racing with questions he'd never thought to ask before. Who had carved this statue? How had it ended up buried on what was now Campbell land? And why did touching it feel like coming home to a place he'd never been? Thomasville had one Catholic church, St. Joseph's, which served the small but growing Hispanic population in the area. David had driven past it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought, but today he found himself pulling into the parking lot. Father Miguel Rodriguez had been serving St. Joseph's for 8 years, ministering to a congregation that faced constant challenges related to immigration status, language barriers, and cultural isolation in a predominantly Protestant community. He was a gentle man in his 50s, originally from El Salvador, who had learned to navigate the complex dynamics of being a Catholic priest in the Deep South. When David Campbell walked into his office carrying a dirt-stained statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Father Rodriguez's first thought was that this was some kind of setup. Perhaps local teenagers playing a prank, or worse, someone looking to cause trouble for his parish. Father Rodriguez, David said hesitantly. I'm sorry to bother you, but I found something, and I don't know what to do with it. He set the statue carefully on the priest's desk. Father Rodriguez's expression changed immediately from caution to amazement. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the carved figure. Dios mío, he whispered. Where did you find this? On my family's land. Well, it's about to be our land. We just bought it from the bank after the previous owners lost it to foreclosure. The Hernandez property? You knew them. Father Rodriguez nodded sadly. They were good people. Maria and Jose Hernandez. They attended Mass here regularly until they lost the farm. This. He gestured toward the statue. This must have been theirs. I was clearing land for a house foundation when I hit it with an excavator. It was buried about 3 feet down. The priest walked around his desk to examine the statue more closely. It's beautiful. Very old, I think. And it's Our Lady of Guadalupe. She's especially beloved by Mexican families. David watched the priest's gentle reverence as he studied the carving. Father, can I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course. When I touched it, when I first touched the statue, I felt something. I can't explain what, but it was like. David struggled for words. Like she was real. Like she was there with me. Father Rodriguez smiled, but not in a condescending way. That doesn't sound strange at all, my son. Our Lady has a way of making herself known to those who need her most. But I'm not Catholic. I'm Presbyterian. My family would be horrified if they knew I was here. And yet here you are. David nodded, still trying to understand his own motivations. I don't know why I came here. I just knew I couldn't take her home. Not yet. What do you want to do? I want to learn about her. About this statue, about the family that lost it, about... about why I feel so different since I found her." Father Rodriguez studied the young man's face carefully. David Campbell didn't look like the typical convert. He was clearly from old Southern Protestant stock, the kind of family that had probably been suspicious of Catholics for generations. But there was something in his eyes that the priest recognized, the look of someone who had encountered the divine unexpectedly and couldn't quite process the experience. "Would you like to hear the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe?" Father Rodriguez asked. "Yes, sir. I would." For the next hour, as the afternoon heat built outside the small church office, Father Rodriguez told David about the apparition at Tepeyac Hill in 1531, about Juan Diego and the miraculous image that appeared on his tilma, about how Our Lady of Guadalupe became the patron saint of Mexico and the Americas. David listened with the intensity of someone hearing a story that explained something he'd always felt but never understood. "She appeared to an indigenous man," Father Rodriguez explained, "at a time when his people were oppressed and marginalized. She spoke to him in his own language, and asked him to build a church where all people could come to her for comfort and protection. And people believed him? Not at first. The Spanish bishop demanded proof. So Our Lady filled Juan Diego's tilma with roses that couldn't grow in that climate, and when he opened it before the bishop, her image was miraculously imprinted on the fabric." David was quiet for a long moment. "Father, I don't understand what's happening to me. I've never been particularly religious, even though my family goes to church every Sunday. But when I touched that statue, you felt her love? I felt like I was being welcomed home by someone who'd been waiting for me my whole life." Father Rodriguez nodded knowingly. "Our Lady doesn't ask permission before she enters our hearts, David. She simply comes when we need her most." As the afternoon wore on, David found himself reluctant to leave. Father Rodriguez showed him around the small church, explaining the symbolism in the stained glass windows, the significance of the various saints, and the role of Mary in Catholic theology. "We don't worship her," the priest clarified, knowing this was a common Protestant misconception. "We honor her as the Mother of God and ask for her intercession. She always points us toward her Son, Jesus." By the time David finally left St. Joseph's that evening, he was carrying more than just questions about a buried statue. He was carrying the beginning of a spiritual awakening that would challenge everything he thought he knew about faith, family, and his own identity. The statue remained with Father Rodriguez for safekeeping, but David promised to return the next day to continue their conversation. As he drove home through the gathering dusk, David wondered how he was going to explain his absence to his family, and more importantly, how he was going to explain the transformation taking place in his heart. Because one thing was becoming clear: the young Presbyterian farmer who had started excavating that morning was gone forever, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that God's love was bigger, more mysterious, and more welcoming than he'd ever imagined. The question now was, what was he going to do about it? That evening, David sat across from his parents at the dinner table, pushing his mother's famous fried chicken around his plate while his mind replayed every moment of his extraordinary day. The familiar rhythm of family conversation, his father discussing cotton prices, his mother planning the church potluck schedule, felt like it was happening in a different universe. "You're quiet tonight, son," James Campbell observed, studying his boy over his glasses. "Long day in the heat got you worn down?" "Something like that," David replied, not technically lying but certainly not telling the whole truth. Ruth Campbell set down her sweet tea, and fixed her son with a penetrating look that had extracted confessions from him since childhood. "David Campbell, you've got that look. The same one you had when you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with your baseball and tried to hide it for 3 days." David's stomach clenched. His mother's intuition was legendary in the Campbell household. "Just thinking about the land, Mom. It's a big responsibility, taking on the new property." "Speaking of which," James said, cutting into his chicken, "how far did you get with the excavation today? We need to have the foundation poured before the weather turns." "I ran into some complications. Hit something underground with the excavator. Old septic system. Something like that." David hated lying to his parents, but he knew with absolute certainty that mentioning a Catholic statue would trigger a family crisis of biblical proportions. His grandfather had once driven 40 miles out of his way to avoid passing a Catholic church during a funeral procession, claiming he wouldn't enable papist nonsense even by accident. After dinner, David retreated to his childhood bedroom in the old farmhouse where 4 generations of Campbells had been raised. The walls were covered with 4-H ribbons, high school football trophies, and family photos stretching back to sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had probably never questioned their Protestant faith for a single day. David pulled out his laptop and spent the next 3 hours researching everything he could find about Our Lady of Guadalupe, Catholic Marian theology, and the history of religious conversion. What he discovered challenged every assumption he'd grown up with about Catholic idol worship and unbiblical practices. The more he read, the more he realized how little he actually knew about the faith tradition that claimed over 1 billion followers worldwide. The theological sophistication, the rich history of scholarship, the emphasis on social justice and care for the poor, none of it matched the caricature he'd been taught to believe. Most importantly, he learned that Catholics didn't worship Mary at all. They honored her as the Mother of God and asked for her intercession, believing that she, like all saints, could pray on behalf of the faithful. It was no different, David realized, than asking his own mother to pray for him when he was struggling. By midnight, David had made a decision that would have shocked his family awake if they'd known about it. He was going to spend the next day learning everything he could about Catholic theology, not to debunk it, but to understand it. The following morning, David called in sick to the excavation work, another lie that sat heavy in his stomach, and drove straight to St. Joseph's. Father Rodriguez was preparing for morning mass when David knocked on the church office door. "David," the priest smiled warmly, "I wondered if you might return. How are you feeling about everything?" "Confused, mostly, but also curious." "Father, would it be possible for me to attend your Mass this morning? I've never been to a Catholic service." "Of course. You're always welcome here." The next hour was unlike anything David had ever experienced. The liturgy was formal but beautiful, with responses and prayers that clearly went back centuries. Father Rodriguez's homily focused on the parable of the prodigal son, a message about unconditional love and welcome that seemed directed specifically at David's situation. But what struck David most powerfully was the moment during the consecration when Father Rodriguez elevated the host and declared, "This is my body, given up for you." The reverence in the small congregation, the sense of sacred mystery, the profound silence that fell over the sanctuary, it all felt more spiritually authentic than anything David had experienced in 22 years of Presbyterian services. After Mass, Father Rodriguez introduced David to several parishioners, including Maria Santos, an elderly Mexican woman who had known the Hernandez family well. Jose and Maria were good people, she told David in accented but clear English. They lost everything, but they never lost their faith. That statue you found, it belonged to Maria's grandmother. It came with her family from Guadalajara over 100 years ago. What happened to them? The Hernandez family. They moved to Atlanta. Jose found work in construction. But Maria, she cried for weeks about leaving that statue behind. They had to bury it quick when the bank came. She said Our Lady would protect the land until the right person found her. David felt chills run down his spine. She said that. See, Maria always said Our Lady of Guadalupe watches over immigrants, over people who are far from home. Maybe she was watching over you too, no? Over the following weeks, David developed a routine that required increasingly creative explanations to his family. He would work on the land clearing for a few hours each morning, then spend his afternoons at St. Joseph's, reading Catholic theology, talking with Father Rodriguez, and slowly discovering a spiritual depth he'd never known existed. The transformation wasn't just intellectual, it was profoundly emotional and spiritual. David found himself praying the rosary, a practice that would have horrified his Protestant ancestors but brought him a peace he'd never experienced. He began attending daily Mass, not just Sunday services, and discovered a relationship with Jesus that felt more intimate and personal than anything his Presbyterian upbringing had offered. Most significantly, he developed a devotion to Mary that seemed to flow naturally from his growing understanding of her role in salvation history. She wasn't a competitor with Jesus for worship. She was the person who had said yes to God's plan and brought Jesus into the world. She was the mother who had stood at the foot of the cross and shared in her son's suffering. She was the woman who, according to Catholic teaching, continued to intercede for believers as a loving mother intercedes for her children. The statue remained in Father Rodriguez's office, but David visited it daily, spending time in prayer and reflection before the carved image that had changed his life. Sometimes he swore he could see compassion in the stone eyes, as though Our Lady of Guadalupe was pleased with his spiritual journey. But David knew he couldn't keep his double life hidden forever. The crisis came on a Sunday in late September. David had attended early Mass at St. Joseph's and was planning to join his family for their usual Presbyterian service when his cell phone rang. "David, honey," his mother's voice was tight with worry. "Mrs. Patterson just called from church. She said she saw you coming out of the Catholic Church this morning. Please tell me she was mistaken." David's blood turned to ice. Mrs. Patterson was the biggest gossip in Thomasville, and if she knew about his visits to St. Joseph's, the entire Presbyterian congregation would know by the end of the day. "Mom, I can explain." "You'd better be able to explain, because your father is angrier than I've seen him since you wrecked his truck in high school." When David arrived home 20 minutes later, both his parents were waiting in the living room with expressions that suggested an impending apocalypse. "Sit down, son," James Campbell said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We need to talk." For the next 2 hours, David explained everything. The discovery of the statue, his visits to St. Joseph's, his growing attraction to Catholic theology, and his developing relationship with Mary. He tried to emphasize that he hadn't converted, that he was simply exploring and asking questions. His parents' reactions were everything he'd feared and worse. "David," his mother said, tears streaming down her face, "how could you do this to us? To our family?" To 5 generations of Campbell faith. I'm not doing anything to anyone, Mom. I'm just trying to understand what I experienced when I found that statue. What you experienced, his father said coldly, was demonic deception. Catholics worship idols, son. They pray to dead people instead of Jesus Christ. It's exactly the kind of false religion the Bible warns us against. Dad, have you ever actually studied Catholic theology? Because I have, and it's nothing like what you're describing. I don't need to study heresy to recognize it. The argument continued for hours, with David trying to explain his spiritual journey, and his parents becoming increasingly convinced that their son was being led astray by Satan himself. If you continue down this path, James finally said, you cannot be part of this family's farming operation. I will not have Catholic corruption infecting our business or our legacy. And you cannot live in this house, Ruth added, her voice breaking. I won't watch my son destroy his soul and dishonor his ancestors. David stared at his parents in shock. He'd expected anger, disappointment, even horror. But he hadn't expected to be disowned. You're kicking me out? We're giving you a choice, James said. Give up this Catholic nonsense, destroy that statue, and never set foot in that church again, or find somewhere else to live. David looked around the living room where he'd grown up, at the family Bible on the mantel, at the photos of 4 generations of Presbyterian Campbells. Everything in this room represented his heritage, his identity, his place in the world. But then he thought about the peace he'd found in the statue's carved face, the spiritual depth he discovered in Catholic theology, the sense of being welcomed home by a love he'd never known existed. I need time to think, he said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, his father replied. Make your choice. That night, David drove to St. Joseph's and found Father Rodriguez preparing for evening prayer. Father, I need your help. My family found out about my visits here, and they've given me an ultimatum. Give up my interest in Catholicism or lose my family, my home, and my inheritance. Father Rodriguez listened compassionately as David poured out his heartbreak and confusion. David, the priest said gently when he finished, conversion is never easy, especially when it requires sacrifice. But you have to ask yourself, what is God calling you to do? I don't know. I love my family, and I don't want to hurt them. But I also can't deny what I've experienced. When I found that statue, when I touched it, something in my heart changed forever. Let me tell you something about Our Lady of Guadalupe, Father Rodriguez said. When she appeared to Juan Diego, she asked him to do something that seemed impossible. Convince the Spanish bishop to build a church for indigenous people who were considered inferior and unworthy. Juan Diego was afraid. He knew he would face rejection, ridicule, even persecution. What did he do? He trusted that Our Lady's love was stronger than human opposition. He delivered her message, even when it cost him everything familiar and comfortable in his life. David spent that night in prayer before the statue that had started his spiritual journey. As he knelt there in the quiet church, he felt the same peaceful presence he'd experienced that first day in the Georgia dirt. Mary, he whispered, I don't know what to do. Help me understand what you want from me. The answer came not as a voice or a vision, but as a deep, unshakable certainty in his heart. He was being called to something greater than family expectations or cultural traditions. He was being called to follow his conscience, even when it led away from everything familiar. The next morning, David packed his belongings into his pickup truck and drove to his parents' house for what he knew would be the last time in the foreseeable future. "Have you made your decision?" his father asked when David knocked on the door. "I have. Dad, Mom, I love you both more than I can express. But I can't deny what God has shown me. I can't pretend that finding that statue didn't change my life." His mother began crying again. "David, please. Think about what you're throwing away." "I'm not throwing anything away, Mom. I'm following where God is leading me, even when it's hard." "That's not God leading you," his father said angrily. "That's Catholic deception and idol worship." "Then we'll have to agree to disagree." David left his house keys on the kitchen table and walked away from the only home he'd ever known. 6 months later, David Campbell was received into the Catholic Church at the Easter Vigil, with Father Rodriguez serving as his sponsor. The ceremony took place in the same small sanctuary where he'd first learned about Our Lady of Guadalupe, in the presence of the parishioners who had become his new family. The statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, now cleaned and restored, was given a place of honor in St. Joseph's Sanctuary, where it served as a reminder that divine love often comes to us in unexpected ways and calls us to unexpected places. David found work with a landscaping company and rented a small apartment in town. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he felt called to live. His parents refused all contact, and the Campbell farming legacy passed to a cousin who had never questioned the family's Protestant traditions. The pain of that loss never fully went away, but David found consolation in his growing faith, and in the certainty that he had followed his conscience rather than his comfort. 2 years after his conversion, David received a letter that he kept in his wallet until the day he died. It was from Maria Hernandez, the woman whose family had lost the farm and buried the statue before the foreclosure. "Dear David, Father Rodriguez told me about how you found our statue and how it changed your life. I wanted you to know that before we buried her, I prayed that Our Lady of Guadalupe would bless whoever found her and bring them closer to her son Jesus. My grandmother always said that Our Lady doesn't choose the easy path for the people she loves. She chooses the path that leads to the greatest good, even when it requires sacrifice. Thank you for caring for our statue and for letting her change your heart. My family is praying for you and for your parents, that someday they will understand that God's love is bigger than any one tradition. Your sister in Christ, Maria Hernandez. P.S. We are back in Mexico now, helping my husband's family with their farm. But we will never forget Georgia, and we will never forget that Our Lady was watching over our land even after we had to leave it.